Hello, my name is Peter Bell. I'm here with Dr. Tim Marsh from Bell Copper. Hello, Tim.
Howdy, Peter.
Wonderful to be talking with you. Let's discuss some of these new maps that the company has made available in their presentation deck and elsewhere.
We can start with the IP map.
Maybe one thing to point out to begin with about this one is just the boundary, the eastern boundary of it. Always makes me laugh to look at the way your property was expanded there, but a lot of what was added to it there is not covered in this survey.
That's right. As soon as Kennecott began directing their own work, we asked them right at the beginning, "Hey, please let us drill K12. We think we know where this thing is. K12 is the spot. Let us do that." When they allowed us to drill that hole, and it was probably Bell's best hole to date, even after the Kennecott drilling was completed. But immediately after that, they got out on the ground and completed this IP survey. It's really the first comprehensive IP survey of the entire land package that we had at the time they started, and their response at seeing this large chargeability anomaly, the area shown in magenta and orange, mainly in the northeast corner of their survey area, triggered them to expand our land position to the east and to the north by 55%. In spite of that action, which seems pretty definitive, you're going out and acquiring new ground because the thing you're looking for, in their case, they were looking for chargeability, extends beyond the limits of their survey. Over the course of the option agreement, they never went back out on the ground to determine the extent of that IP anomaly. So that remains unsurveyed, hanging off the edge of the map, nothing but blue sky to the east and then north, if you like chargeability. It's a good indication for me. We now know what causes it. There are kind of spurious geological things that can cause strong IP, but we now know after drilling 7 holes into IP highs that it represents disseminated pyrite. It could have been chalcocite. That's what Kennecott was hoping. We know that it's disseminated pyrite, and there's probably a lot more of it to be found to the east and to the north.
Yeah. And all of that fits in with standard model for these deposits, the pyrite and the lead zinc around the edges, kind of distal to the source, main copper shell.
That's right. Fluids that are brought up from the mantle into the shallow part of the crust diffuse away from the heat source. They spread out. Lead and zinc don't form stable solid minerals at temperatures of 350 or 400 or 500 degrees centigrade. They don't begin to form solids until they get out into cooler zones, and so they end up forming a halo around the hottest area.
Yeah.
And we see pretty distinctly from K15 wrapping around through K17, K11, K9 and 10, K8, 13, 14, even K18, considerable lead and zinc. And that roughly coincides with where the highest IP anomalies are, which is where another mineral that comes out in a shell external to the hot zone, pyrite, forms in greatest abundance. So pyrite is chargeable. It responds to the IP, and it tends to form a halo, a shell around the hottest zone. We know, if you go back to our fault model, that the area we're exploring came from a patch of ground 9 or so kilometers to the west of us. There is a pyrite shell there, very clearly a pyrite shell surrounding a central zone of quartz magnetite stockwork veins and potassic alteration that represents the hottest part of the system.
Yep.
So we are seeing in the hanging wall some zonation that that correlates broadly to the pattern we see back in the footwall. We see a shell of lead and zinc. We see a nearly coincident shell of abundant pyrite. Those two shells surround an undrilled area labeled copper shell on our map, on our IP map. And that's the area that, Bell is going to get into and drill test in the coming weeks.
And interesting to see that those highs are really quite strong highs as well, maybe indicating that, things are a little bit closer off to the east than to the west over, looking at K11, for example, there's a high, but it's not quite as high as the other.
That's right. And that's a real good point. We know as we've moved eastward, the depth of cover has decreased. The bedrock, the pyrite is closer to surface. Our drill hole depths are less. The abundance of pyrite may well be the same at K11 as it is at K13, but we know the depth of cover at K11 is over 1,700 feet, and that difference in cover depth may be the difference there in the chargeability between those two holes.
And how about this little blue chargeability low right there in the middle of the shell, and the other one kind of just east of K8 there?
Yeah, both of those lows may, in fact, relate to a poor job of the electrode that was pounded into the ground at the surface, making electrical connection with the deep subsurface. The desert soils are dry, and it's a challenge to get electricity into the ground. It's clear that we have over most of that survey area where you see magenta and red. It's clear we got juice down into the pyrite, and we saw the chargeability effect. But it may well be that a single electrode situated about halfway in between those two lows, the one east of K8 and the one north of K12, just failed to plug into that system and left us with a couple of spurious data points.
What was the spacing in between those electrodes?
I think the electrodes were 300 meters apart. I may be wrong there, but 300 meters, about 1,000 feet between the electrodes. So
far enough that, that little blue area could really just be from each of those blue areas, it could be from one that was, not connecting down while the ones around it were.
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting. All these layers of information that you go to great lengths to gather, and then always a bit of discretion involved in what weighting and interpretation you give any one of them. Right.
Yeah. For the time being, I don't weight that blue area inside the copper shell very highly. I'm not going to go out and drill it thinking it's something special. I can imagine ways in which, maybe it is real, but it really isn't what I'm after right now. I'm after rocks that in general are chargeable. If there's copper sulfide in them, they will be chargeable. Generally, they won't be as chargeable as abundant pyrite, just because pyrite's a very common mineral, and there will be more of it, and therefore more chargeable than copper sulfides.
And I wonder, I guess it's possible to go out and redo some of those lines with the IP and all that, but from what I've heard from you, you have the confidence to get out there with the drill and test it.
Yeah, that's right. Geophysical data has a good use, and in this case, it was fantastically successful in demonstrating the extent of chargeable rocks. It's really the kilometers wide anomaly that we needed to see out there. That is the scale of the target that we've been chasing for years. There is a manifestation in the chargeability that matches the sort of target we've been looking for. And between the chargeability anomaly and the follow-up drilling that Kennecott did, they seem to have outlined a very compelling, still giant target. It's as big as anything in production in Arizona or contemplated for production in Arizona. It's only the very biggest in the world that wouldn't fit in between our current drill holes.
Well, I appreciate you talking with me about it there, because kind of helps explain why the Kennecott people might have headed off to the east too. Really seeing the highs over there and the low in the shell.
Yep.
So, and maybe one question of the lead zinc shell there off kind of to the southwest, the southern edge of that, there doesn't seem to be too much of a high, right? There's kind of a front there and maybe going off a little bit to the west around K10 and things like that. But any sense from, the geology that you're seeing there at surface about what could be happening to be responsible for that relative low kind of in the southwest of this indicated lead zinc shell?
Let's see. I'm not sure I know where you're talking.
To the kind of west and south of K8. So
the west and
K7
south of K8. Well, it looks like it's just things are kind of fading out in that direction.
Yeah. So what confidence, I guess, does that layer of information, give you confidence about a lead zinc shell being present at depth there, just because it's beyond the range of the IP?
Well, I'm really not too concerned about lead and zinc. I'm not concerned about defining the limits of the lead zinc shell. It's a good academic exercise. How close or how far can you be and still detect the lead zinc shell? That's a good academic exercise, and an explorationist would want to get that, but I can't do that with shareholder money. I've got to focus on the prize, and that's internal to that lead zinc shell.
Well, and the fact that you're not seeing a high out there to the southwest doesn't kill the idea per se.
Well, let's see. It doesn't kill the idea that there's a copper shell to the southwest?
Well, no, but just a sense of how broad the lead zinc shell might be in relation to the copper shell there.
Yeah,
I'm
not sure I follow quite where you want to go. I guess one thing that might be important to consider is this hydrothermal system is not invading a perfectly homogeneous permeable medium. It is encountering faults and cracks and a messy environment, and the fluids go where the cracks are. So it may well be that we got an unusual sample of the system out there at K9 and K10 and K17, just maybe because we were beside some big crack that has funneled lead and zinc further to the west than elsewhere.
Yeah.
And
it's a function of my brain trying to think of it as a nice, familiar shape, when the reality is that it's probably going to be much messier, as you say.
You imagine a fractal pattern that's dense and in the vicinity of the copper shell, and then branching outward away from that. You're going to have just due to kind of random variations. You're going to have large areas in the more distal positions where there's no hint of mineralization from the center, and other branches where you're going to have even bits of the copper shell leaking out. And it's really little leaks like that we saw in K9 and K10 that says, hey, we're getting close to something. We could see some bornite occasionally in K9 and K10. We could see some molybdenite, and those are things that are generally associated with the center of the copper shell.
Wonderful. the process of exploration.
Yeah.
And so maybe to move on to the next map, I have the factor analysis of the drill holes you've done. So I understand you've a statistical methodology here that you're using. Is it fairly widely used for this type of exploration?
I think it is. As more and more people spend the money to obtain multi-element geochem data, and by multi-element, it's pretty common now to get a package of analyses with 48 elements off the periodic table reported for a pretty reasonable price. And what you find is that nature doesn't have 48 independent ways of behaving. The elements themselves are grouped in the periodic table because of similarities they have with each other, similarities in the way they combine with other elements. That structure in the periodic table makes the elements behave similarly in a porphyry copper system. So the system injects a homogeneous fluid that's got all these different metals in them, and then they begin to spread out and behave according to their electron configurations, and the lead and the zinc and the cadmium, they tend to behave similarly, and they end up in the same relative position surrounding the hot core of the system. The molybdenum, the rhenium, the copper, the gold tend to drop out in a hotter patch of ground. And factor analysis allows you to look at 48 apparently independent elements and say, you know what, we could simplify this a lot without losing much information if we just said there were only 3 or 4 variables embedded in all of those analyses. And those variables, rather than being individual elements, they're groups of elements that are behaving similarly.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, to ask you, the factor weightings, are those something that you're kind of calibrating yourself with data specific to this project, or is there some, set of parameters out there in the academic literature that says what, weight should be on the different elements?
No, I've done this so many times and just kind of developed my own approach, and I'm very leery of any kind of single parameter indicator. Yep. Anything that is susceptible to outliers, I really stray away from. And so what I've done, I've really on this map showing the factor scores, or the rank sum of the factor scores for the copper, moly, rhenium, sulfur, gold factor. You've got one dot there, and yet each one of those dots represents dozens to hundreds of analyses going down that hole. So how do you do it? How do you summarize all of that data and not bias your analysis between a drill hole that's got only 12 samples and a drill hole that's got 150 samples? And how do you do it in a robust way that doesn't contaminate one particular hole with an outlier or two and bias you in a particular direction? And so I spend a lot of time coming up with robust procedures that give me consistent results. And the rank sum approach is one that I use. I slice the histogram of weightings at 5 different levels in the upper tail of the histogram. So I look at the 80 percentile value, the 90 percentile value, 95, 99, and so I score each drill hole based on where it falls on those percentile slices through their distributions, and rank them according to their simple rank, their numerical or order rank from best hole to worst hole.
Yep.
And I look at it in nothing less than 10 different ways. I got 10 independent scoring approaches, and this rank sum approach is the one that sort of pulls everything together and tells me which of those assays, which of those many assays paint a picture that I can trust, that I can really go out and spend money on and not worry that, gee, I got suckered in by one high value over in this hole over there, and I'm headed the wrong direction. So
yeah. Well, not quite a black box, but maybe an expert system or something like that.
One important result is you see high values in the three highest values, K11, K12, and way back in the footwall in K3. And that is a really neat result, and it's what you would expect if the same system were cut into two pieces and separated. You would expect to see this factor showing up in two places, in the footwall and in the hanging wall, and that's just what we get.
Yeah. And then just to be clear from my understanding, this is just referring to the holes in here. So all of the ranking that you're doing, you're just talking about ranking the holes and across the hole, the entire width of the holes. You mentioned
right.
80% out. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. So there's about 2,300 analyses. Each analysis has 48 elements that were measured. I threw them all into a bin, and factor analysis says, hey, look, here's one variable that will preserve a lot of this information much more simply, and that's what factor analysis does. It allows you to simplify a complicated data set into a few factors. And what's neat is what falls out. This particular factor is probably the third most important factor in the entire set. Lead, zinc, cadmium was another factor that pops up. I've done this to many different porphyry copper systems, and you get the same results. Sometimes gold shows up in with the copper, sometimes it shows up over with antimony and arsenic, and but in general you see the same pattern. So it's not the first time I've seen this pattern. It's one I'm real familiar with, and the story is that we've got a region out there that nobody's put a drill hole into that seems to be leaking copper, moly, rhenium, sulfur, and gold. Bell needs to get out and drill it.
Well, and the place that it's leaking it too, with K11 and K12, that sounds a bit like the chargeability high leaking off to the west towards K9 and K10 there.
That's right. That's the way I see it.
Great. I wonder where the hot spots are on the factor for the lead lead there, and what that would show about the lead zinc shell. Not something, not the primary thing to be looking at, but just more evidence, I guess, to support.
Yep, I've done the analysis. I've looked at 15 different factors, determined which ones were related to porphyry mineralization, which ones were just not economically significant and related to wall rock factors. And the lead zinc shell, as drawn on this diagram, was drawn using the factor analysis with the lead zinc factor highlighted. So it's got a completely different set of rank sums, and you'll see all of those holes in the lead zinc shell with very strong lead zinc rank sums, and then the holes out to the south and west with very low scores.
Yeah. Well, and for you who was there watching, the core come out of the ground, it's not just a statistical exercise. You have all that kind of ground truth experience beforehand. You may color your approach to some degree, but that's okay. It's exploration work.
Yeah, there are mineralogical factors that relate directly back to these geochemical factors. There's very strong correlation between when I'm seeing sphalerite and galena in the core, and where this factor lights up is significant.
And the D vein density, another map that you guys have put out there. Tried to make a point of reading that original paper on D veins. Afraid I haven't been able to get through much of it yet, but would love to take a stab at that, talking about that with you and what these D veins, really the history of the idea there and all that, right? I gather very important for copper porphyry exploration.
Yeah, it's the nomenclature from the geology department at the El Salvador porphyry copper deposit in Chile. It was operated by Anaconda Mining Company, and they had a strong geology department, and the top geologists at that deposit unraveled the sequence of veins that formed in that porphyry copper deposit, and they labeled them A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
D being the youngest veins and A being the earliest veins that form as the deposit cools off. And so those are written up and described in kind of a landmark paper in economic geology in 1975. John Hunt, who recently passed away, was one of the authors, and Lou Gustafson, who's still with us, was the second author. Gustafson and Hunt, 1975, it's a go-to paper for porphyry copper geologists. The D veins in particular tend to occur in the outer parts of the porphyry copper system. They generally don't tend to carry significant copper. They provide evidence of acidic fluids, which form when the sulfur in the hydrothermal fluid becomes oxidized, transforms to sulfuric acid. The effect of that hot sulfuric acid on the rock is to convert any feldspar in the rock into sericite, into muscovite. And the cracks that conduct that acidic hot fluid end up being surrounded by a halo of millimeters to centimeters wide of gray, texturally destructive sericite.
Right.
And we've got some pictures in our core of what these D veins look like. They're very distinctive. You see them all over the world. If you're in and around a porphyry copper deposit anywhere in the world, you're going to see these D veins, and we see them in abundance at Kaba. Two holes in particular have loads of D veins. The last one we drilled, K19, is the most abundant D veins we've seen so far on the project. K11 also had lots of them. And you don't find D veins in other kinds of deposits. They are something unique to porphyry copper deposits.
And, well, all the action of sulfuric acid in the rocks there is pretty distinct effects.
Yep.
So what's the significance of seeing it in K19? I hear you saying that, you typically see them kind of on the edges.
Yeah, it fits the geochemical position for K19. K19 we saw very I don't want to confuse the primary and the secondary effects, the late oxidation and the primary effects, but yeah. K19 had a lot of lead and zinc in it. We terminated the hole in good zinc mineralization, so it's that puts it in a peripheral position. The D veins fit in with that. You generally don't find D veins right in the middle of the system where the copper shell is. They're generally external to it.
And how quick or kind of dramatic is that shift from the lead zinc shell to the copper shell generally?
Well, I don't think I've got a good generalization for that. I think it can be razor sharp or gradational.
Okay. But depending on local conditions, there's a variety of things that are possible.
Right.
Yeah, I see K19 kind of right on the edge, marked where you have the copper shell marked there, and I wonder if
Yep.
seeing it there is kind of a problem for the idea of the copper shell being there or not.
No, I don't think so. One of the reasons why I've got that copper shell drawn right up against K19 was because of the chrysocolla that we saw in K19. That's a good indication that there's copper nearby.
Right, because is that a copper zinc mineral or just copper?
Copper silicate.
Okay. And does that tie in with the chemical processes with the sulfuric acid going on with the D veins that you're describing there, or something totally different?
It's not totally different. The D veins likely were the source of sulfur that was used to mobilize the copper, but the oxidation that produced the sulfuric acid was supergene, was tens of millions of years after the porphyry system had cooled off. As soon as oxygen gets down to the pyrite in the D veins and the disseminated pyrite, then you make sulfuric acid, but at room temperature.
Yeah.
And that acid attacks the rock and leaches copper sulfides to make oxide copper minerals like copper silicate chrysocolla.
Okay. Right. So these two phases, different timelines of things going on with the sulfuric acid, the hot sulfuric acid, the D veins at the formation, and then the oxidation with the happening later.
Yep.
Well, you pulled me thoroughly out of my depth as a geological speculator or spectator, but always appreciate learning things from you and helping, you get the word out there about what you're doing at site. There's one more map, I believe.
You're definitely dangerous now, Peter.
There's a cross-section drill hole with a map showing a cross-section alongside the factor analysis. Really neat to see that cross-section.
So we've taken the 2300 analyses that Kennecott ran on old core and on new core, and for each sample, measured its the amount of the variance in the geochemistry of each sample that can be explained by this copper, moly, rhenium, sulfur, gold factor.
Yep.
And then it showed how much of the sample's variance can be explained by that factor, and plotted that downhole. Of course, we don't have anything decorating the drill holes above the cover rocks. The cover rocks just don't have this stuff in it. But once you get into the laramide and older aged rocks, you begin to see this factor, and you see it most abundantly in K11 and K12. You see it strongly in the bottom of K16. That was a Kennecott hole drilled on an IP high. They got it through the zone of oxidation, through the zone, the transition into sulfides where any chalcocite blanket might be, and they were happy stopping the hole there. I really wasn't. We had chalcopyrite showing in the bottom of that hole, and it wasn't a good place for Bell to be stopping a hole, but we were under their thumb at that point in time. You see the same situation over at K19, where the largest factor loadings for this factor are down in the last assays in the bottom of the hole. Kennecott had tested the target they were looking for, which was supergene enrichment, and stopped in rocks that were just beginning to show the factor that is probably linked most closely to the guts of the copper shell.
Yeah, it looks like K19 is a pretty shallow hole compared to K8, for example.
You bet. And then again, looking back to the west, back to K3 into the footwall, you see very strong loadings of this factor in the root.
Yep.
Would have been the hot source for the copper shell that we're looking for.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, tying it back to K3 is something I missed when I looked at these before on my own there. That's it is great to tie it back to the footwall. I always bring it back to that. Yeah. And one question I had too was about this line. It kind of seems to go over part of the copper shell, but you know, not so much. Do you think this line covers the? Does it really trace through the copper shell in any meaningful way?
No, it doesn't. The line was selected years ago. Once I had an idea that slip along the fault was oriented in an east-northeast direction, and it was really designed to help me put the pieces back together. But coincidentally, it didn't go through where we think the copper shell is. If you wanted a slice through the copper shell, you'd have to kick the angle of the thing around somehow different. So the cross section was set up to follow the movement on the fault, not to follow the long axis of the copper shell. As we progress with future drilling, I'll produce cross sections that run along the long axis of that copper shell, and that will be the orientation that we spend our time studying.
Amazing that there's no holes in that area yet.
It wasn't an idea that Kennecott really had much interest in pursuing. It was Bell's idea. They liked the chargeability highs, and we determined those were disseminated pyrite, and that's where things left off. And we got all of our interest back, and more than $3 million of real high quality geochemical, geophysical, geological data that allow us to take the next steps out at Kaba.
Yeah, that's right. And you're spinning up to do just that.
That's the direction we're heading. We're going to get out on the ground and drill again.
Well, I won't take up any more of your time here. I know you're busy. Thanks very much for talking with me about all this stuff.
You're welcome. Thank you, Peter.